Hello and welcome to another episode of the Storied Arcs podcast. I am your co-host Mike.
And I'm your co-host Alex.
And as is our form, we will be doing a deep dive into indie and creator-owned comics, again with a bit of an asterisk because this is a DC Hanna-Barbera property we're starting with. However, we are looking at someone who primarily creates independently owned comics, and as is usually the case with the Zero episode, I'm going to bank heavily on Alex's encyclopedic knowledge of comics, their creators, and their history. And I guess, we've got a lot of ground to cover between a publisher we've never talked about before, a writer we've never talked about before, and two different artists that we have not yet covered on the podcast. So let's dive straight in.
Sure. Okay, so I guess we'll start with Flintstones coming out of DC. I don't think we need to discuss DC Comics, Detective Comics, as Tom King likes to remind us. It may be a little strange for some people to think as to what the tie between Hanna-Barbera and DC Comics is, or was at least. And it really comes down to, at the time, it was all owned by Time Warner. I guess looking back through the history of Hanna-Barbera, at some point it had been purchased by the Turner Group, and it was under the Cartoon Network banner, and then Turner was absorbed by Time Warner. And so as we came into 2016, 2017-ish time, which is right around the time that DC Rebirth was going on. If you're a superhero reader, that was their second reboot after the New 52, which was in 2011. So they're rebranding all of DC in end of 2015 into 2016. And this I don't know if it was supposed to coincide with it, but it kind of did coincide with it.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say it sounds like, that is classic comic bureaucratic mess right there. You're like, this is their second reboot in the 2010s.
Yeah.
However, I was very happy when Rebirth happened. I was very excited about it, and they brought all of their books down to an introductory price of $2.99.
Yeah, and
I was like, look, I'm going to spend this much money on comics. It's totally up to you, DC, how many characters I'm following for that much money. And I will say now, 7 years later, it went from $2.99 for every character, and I was pulling 4 or 5 characters, and I think I just paid $5.99 for the monthly Batman book. My DC reading has been cut in thirds by their pricing. But anyway, I thought there were a lot of great storytellers and a lot of exciting collaborations that happened around that time.
Oh, there were. Yeah, it was
Batman Elmer Fudd comes to mind as, not a Hanna-Barbera, but just another exciting crossover that came around.
And that was another part of this, is that they did these crossovers not just with Hanna-Barbera, but with Looney Tunes as well. And really, I think they were just meant to be fun, meant to be kind of these one-offs, and they really were. A lot of them, they varied in quality, but some of them were really, really fun. You mentioned Batman Elmer Fudd. That was great. I really enjoyed Martian Manhunter, Marvin the Martian, which is one of those that seems just like, tailor-made to mash up and cross over. But, with the Hanna-Barberas, I think the interesting thing that I remember about this time was that the vast majority of them, especially the initial output for these Hanna-Barbera books, is that all the books had a hook to them. Scooby-Doo, I think it was, Scooby Apocalypse, which is very much like Scooby-Doo, but what if The Walking Dead,
Right.
There was Wacky Wasteland, which was Wacky Wasteland, but make it Mad Max. It was here's the property, and here's this twist on it that we're going to do, and that's going to be your hook. That's going to be what's different. Maybe that's what's edgy about it, but there's something drawing you to it other than just your nostalgic recognition of the title,
Sure.
There's something other there. It's like, I like Scooby-Doo. Oh, Scooby-Doo and zombies, and there's this added layer that's thrown on top, with the exception initially of the Flintstones. When I saw the Flintstones, it looked like the Flintstones.
Sure. I mean,
and there was no other outside. I remember seeing it and passing on the book because, like, it's just the Flintstones. Like, what's up with that? You know, there's no. Of course, now I try to think about what kind of spin you can put on the Flintstones, like Flintstones, but make it modern day. Then it's just like a modern day story,
right? Oh, and yeah, then it's like, or I don't know, Simpsons or Family Guy or something. If it's just modern day,
set in the future, but then that's like what the Jetsons. So I actually don't know what the hook would have been, but right. I can remember seeing that in comparison to the other Hanna-Barbera books and being like, well, that one just kind of looks boring because it just looks like the Flintstones. Like, what's special about that book? And it took word of mouth from other people talking about what was actually in the book, the contents of it, for me to actually get into it. But it was just that was the initial line of Hanna-Barbera. I think it was technically called Hanna-Barbera Beyond. That was the line, I think it was called. And for about three-ish years there, they just they ran a whole bunch of these books and of kind of varying success and kind of accolades. And Flintstones was one of the most, I guess, kind of one of the most lauded. I think it was that, and
I think very much in hindsight, though. Yeah, I mean, I think it. Like, I asked a couple comic owners or shop owners, and I said, have you read this? And now all of them have. Yeah, but a lot of them did. They all had your reaction, and they said it was not flying off the shelves. When I discovered my great love of this, I still have a love of single issues, even though I've tried to move more towards trades, but I was like, this is, we covered it on the podcast. I'd really love to own a first issue and just have a collection of first issues from things we cover on the podcast. And I went on an online, like, comic retailer. It was like below cover price. Yeah. Like this is not it's got great reviews, but it's not a collector's piece. It's not a speculator's piece.
No,
it's just great storytelling.
Yeah.
I think, by the way, those hooks for Hanna-Barbera was meant both to attract writers and to attract readers. It was here's a familiar thing, but it's not boring. It's something new. Yeah, and with Flintstones, they had no idea. I think they were just like, it's an automatic property. We have to publish it. If you're doing Hanna-Barbera, you have to do something with the Flintstones, and it almost doesn't matter what.
No doubt.
Or who.
Doubt.
Because, no doubt. And Mark Russell was a relative no-namer in comics when that happened.
Yeah, and I think we'll touch on. I guess we can move into his bio a little bit here. Yeah, he had only just started writing in comics at DC. He had been given a reboot of Prez, which was an old title from the 60s or 70s or whatnot about a teenager who becomes president. He was given this, what was supposed to be a 12-issue miniseries, kind of updating it and setting it in a kind of a near future, but with kind of a modern day viewpoint. And it was canceled after 6 issues, like very abruptly, just kind of in the middle of got one arc and it was canceled. And he was, he's talked about how he was shocked at that because he didn't understand how that could happen, because he comes from a book world where, like, they can't stop you in the middle of a book, and here he was halfway through and it got canceled. But yet this book is canceled at DC, and DC was like, well, listen, that book's not going to go forward, but we're going to offer you this other book, this other 12-issue miniseries. And that was the Flintstones. So I think it was clear that people at DC liked what he was doing, even if it didn't quite connect maybe with the readership, or if it didn't quite connect. I don't want to say it didn't quite connect with the character or the topic, because Prez, if you read Prez in the same light of kind of all of his kind of comic work, you see the commentary, you see the satire, you see the kind of things he's trying to focus on and bring light to. I just don't think he quite had the voice for it yet, and maybe Perez was a little too focused on the, I don't know, the democratic process, the idea of electing leaders, politicians, how government works. Maybe he's a little too focused on that, and that's obviously something that we cover. We'll see that he covers in Flintstones. Among, it's one of the kind of myriad of topics that he covers. But it didn't quite work. I don't think it quite worked on a focus title like Prez, which is probably why it didn't connect with readers. But the fact that DC was still willing to cancel that book and then immediately give him another one, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it shows great
it's
faith. And I mean, here's the other thing is, who are your readers of Prez? It's people who read the old book, loved it, and are nostalgic, and they're going to pick up the title regardless of the author. Or it's people who you put an author. If you told me Jeff Lemire was writing Prez, guess who'd be pulling Prez? I would be.
Yeah.
But Mark Russell's a no name. You put a no name on there.
Yeah. I would say on the second point, yes. The first point, like, I think Prez, honestly, when he ran like 4 issues, like it was like a nothing title. I only know about Prez because there's one issue of Sandman that deals with Prez. That deals with like all the universe of the Prez. That's the only reason I even knew who the character was. I think, it was like a 4-issue thing back in the day. So I can't imagine there were legions of fans, but I think it was something that someone at DC was like, well, listen, we had this idea. And the whole idea is that, the political process has gone so haywire that you can now vote via like social media or whatnot, blah, blah, blah. And so it was trying to take the trappings of kind of modern day how society works in terms of kind of the flow of information. So I think it was less about the title of Prez and more just about like how screwed up things are in the world, specifically around
but it wasn't introducing a new book with a new concept. It was putting a new concept on an old book.
Yeah. But an old book that I don't think anyone really knew. I'm trying to remember if I can even recall what the conversation was around it. I think I knew one person who was like, this book's really good and really funny. And it was pretty funny. It had some good art there. But it just didn't.
I mean, the way you just described it, I was like, oh, I see why that got through the pitch room.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's a great pitch.
Yeah.
But if the readership isn't there,
it's not going to last.
The big two do not suffer that kind of paltry sales. They will cut and run on stuff a lot faster than these independent publishers, which is why you and I like them. That being said, I just was stumbling through my short box the other day and found the 4-issue series Romulus, and I thought, oh yeah, there's a tragic undercutting from Image. Well,
they're not always
still
going to
happens
land
everywhere.
Yeah, it does. It does. As much as we want to give creators the freedom to tell their own stories and own their own properties, in the end, it's still a business. Some people still got to buy it. People still got to read it, because people have invested into this, and so there has to be some level of return that makes it worthwhile. And it doesn't always work out. But again, I think it's worth noting that DC was willing to go to a writer like Mark Russell, axe the first thing they gave him, and then immediately give him something else. It's almost like they kind of saw, well, maybe we made a little bit of a mistake. Maybe this wasn't the character that was best used for you at this time, and I think there's something to be said about the editorial process in comics, that maybe that someone there saw. I think it might have been Marie Jarvis, who was a longtime editor at DC, who saw something there. Was like, you know what, this one isn't quite working, but I see what he's trying to do, and so maybe we take that and put it somewhere else, and that somewhere else happened to be the Flintstones, and I think it worked out. I think it worked out perfectly.
And that pitch kind of stings a lot in the modern context, to say, oh, we vote by social media and stuff like that. When you look at how the last few elections have gone, it's almost a little too on the nose. It's a little too close to home, and it hurts. To laugh at that.
Yeah.
Go ahead and set it, a few thousand years before now, in the Flintstones. Yeah. And same topic, same thing, but in the same way that like sci-fi works.
I was just going to say that. Yeah. It's all the great science fiction. We set it way in the future. And
you can talk about racism. You can talk about anything in the present day.
Yeah.
Because you feel a little insulated from the criticism that is lobbying against you.
It's so obviously meant to be a metaphor, because we don't live on spaceships and have robots, blah, 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 as opposed to like we're all still on social media and whatnot, where something that's in the near future still is recognizable to us versus the very, very far future or very, very far past. We can put distance there and view it as a metaphor as opposed to like direct commentary, even though they're essentially serving the same purpose. We feel a little more comfortable with that. And that was the playground he was handed with Flintstones. And it was, he made the most of it that I don't know if people were ready for it. And I don't even know if they knew how to market the book. Because like I said, I only heard about it through like word of mouth. One thing we discussed in these episodes is how did we find this book? How did we come to it? And I simply remember seeing it among all of the other Hanna-Barbera books and being like, whatever, that's funny. They're doing that, but I didn't read any of those books. And it was only after another kind of comic podcast that I listened to for a long time called The Comics Conspiracy. It's run by a shop owner out in Sunnyvale, California, a guy named Ryan Higgins. And the guys who work with him and the guys who shop there, he would rave about this book. Like he was like, you have to read Flintstones, people. Like, trust me, you got to read this book. And I think it was after issue 3 that I finally went and picked it up. And I think Up and Away, our comic shop here, still had copies of the first. The issue 3 had just come out that Wednesday, and they still had copies of the first 2. And I read all 3 that day, and like my mind melted, and I was like, okay, I'm subscribing to this book. I got to read it. I get it now. But as I think you and I will talk about, if I had just read issue 1, not certain I would have stuck with it, because I think issue 1 is the weakest. But knowing that I had 3 of them there, and that it was so praised and lauded by
people you respect, which is
people I've listened to and people whose taste that I know because I've been listening to it for so long. Someone that I trusted, I was willing to give it a shot, and I'm so glad that I did. And so even though I was 3 issues late, you could say, I was still, I think, on the early end of the bandwagon, because I think this is a book that people just every so often you can go in the year since it finished up. It only ran from July 2016 to June 2017. It only ran for those 12 issues, one year straight. In the years since, you could search online, various social media posts, search Flintstones, DC or whatever, and you'll find people who have just been like, did you guys read this Flintstones book? It's amazing. This is incredible.
But everyone has the same experience of thinking they've discovered it and they're the only ones who know.
Exactly.
Which is actually part of the charm to me. Like, I agree, because
there's so little buzz around it that when you find it, you're like, oh my God, I got to tell you about this. Do you know about it? Because it's not like picking up a lauded book that everyone says is lauded, that you read it and you're like, oh yeah, that was great. This is a book that like no one talks about, or seemingly no one talks about. There's no discussion about it. So when you find it, you feel the need to tell everyone, hey, go read this book. It's so amazing. And you feel like you have to proselytize for it because you want more people to read it, and it's been happening for the past the 5 years since it's finished. It's every once in a while there's a push for it. It's
if we're being like candid, that's basically what our podcast is.
Exactly. It's what we're trying to do.
You and I saying like, oh my gosh, we found this thing. Okay. So we started with Paper Girls. Yeah. Most comic readers are aware of Paper Girls. Maybe you're Big Two only and you've never ventured into indie. Yeah. Paper Girls is a great place to start. You still heard of it. Yeah.
And you've probably heard of it and Brian K. Vaughan,
Yeah. Even though Brian K. Vaughan, not a lot of stuff from Marvel DC. Like if you only read superheroes, you may not be super familiar with Brian K. Vaughan.
Well, that all depends on when you started reading. Because I mean,
that's true. He did Batman.
He had a long CV before that, building his name up at the Big Two, doing for hire work, and then goes in and just does creator own stuff now. But yeah, we these are books we think are great. We think more people should read because I think they're worthwhile. And I don't think Flintstones is one of the ones that most people would think of, because most people have an idea of what Flintstones are, whether that's because they grew up with the cartoon or because of the vitamins, or they grew up with the idea of the cartoon, Right. I think you and I are just old enough to where the reruns of the cartoon would have been on like constant, you know?
Yeah, I saw a lot of reruns, but
Mhm.
as I picked up this book, and I'll discuss this more when we get into the book itself, I had like broad stroke caricatures of it. Like, you know,
Yeah.
I don't remember specific plot beats. I don't remember what happened. I think it was just one of those completely non-serialized shows. You know, you can watch something the first year it started and the last year it ended, and you don't need to know anything that happened in between because everything is just standalone. And I think the book largely preserves that. Like there's some serialized stories to it, but you could pick up issue 3, for instance, and be fine. Like it's a good standalone piece.
I agree. There are some serialized. It's more there are serialized themes versus serialized storyline or plot. There's very little serialized plot where like if you haven't read issue 4, you will be lost when you get to issue 5. No. But if you haven't read issue 4, there may be some underlying themes or topics or commentary that they're laying down that maybe you don't quite get if you only read issue 5. So it's kind of it's a different kind of serialization, I think. That makes the book, a little different.
Yeah, I mean, I found it refreshing. It's one that I've already given away my physical copy to someone to read. And it's the deluxe edition. You know, it's a beautiful hardback with a really great letter from Mark Russell that we'll read later in this Zero episode. But just to close the loop on how we stumbled across it, you found it years before I did. This 2022, we're recording this. I believe I found it in 2022 because of a comic podcast or comic pop culture, X-Ray Vision. Jason Mantzoukas was on as a guest, was plugging this. And Jason Concepcion, the host of that podcast, who I have a great deal of respect for, just a tremendous nerd with a great encyclopedic knowledge of comics, had never heard of this book. Like, maybe in the same way as you had a vague recollection of like, oh yeah, I saw some Hanna-Barbera stuff. I saw it in the shop when it came out. I assumed it was for kids because it was Flintstone Peen. I never thought they would write Flintstones for adults.
And yes, and I think that was part of the marketing issue there, or maybe not an issue, but kind of the hang up for a lot of readers, because I think I'm in that same boat there. I looked at it and I passed it for the same reason. Yeah.
So anyway, shouts to those two comic podcasts, which turned both of us onto this book. And I will say, you're welcome to track down that episode of X-Ray Vision where Jason Mantzoukas was on, but it's like a 2-minute plug at tops.
Oh yeah, he raves about it. Yeah,
we're not doing what he did. We're not just saying, "Oh, this is a good book. Go read this." We're gonna go issue by issue, theme by theme, beat by beat, and really get into Mark Russell's worldview and how he uses The Simpsons to portray that and depict that and how it speaks to our modern world. Or what did I say?
You said The Simpsons.
The Simpsons. No, that one's all on the surface. That's all self-evident. Flintstones. Yeah, we're recording in the morning and my brain doesn't typically work before noon.
Yeah, it's all right. It's all right. So yeah, should we get in? I guess let's cover real quick here before we get into a little more of kind of Mark Russell's specific CV. We'll cover. Let's get this out of the way here. Flintstones, as I mentioned, is 12 issues. Mark Russell is writer, Steve Pugh as artist. We'll get into him a little bit later. Colorist Chris Chuckery and letters by Dave Sharp. They work on all 12 issues with the exception of issue 7, which kicks off the second arc, as it were. Not really story arcs, but second collection. There's one fill-in artist where Rick Leonardi does pencils and Scott Hanna does inks. So giving Steve Pugh a month off there just as a break. But the book was nominated for 2 Eisners the years it came out. So I guess it would have came out in 2016. So I think it's the 2017 Eisners. It was up for best limited series and best humor publication. It lost both of those, which is, unfortunate. It was a book that I remember seeing in the Eisners thinking like, oh, this is great that it got nominated because it means people in the industry think it's a worthwhile book, but
sure,
hoping that it would at least win something so that because there are a number of people who read comic books. Like if this book had been an Eisner winner, you go into a lot of shops and they'll put that like on an end table or something like that. Be like Eisner winners of the year. And that's enough for people to pick up a book they never heard of, just like any other award show. If you walk into
absolutely, that's how I pick up, and that's how especially if I want to get into things, if I've started to cultivate an interest in jazz in like the last 5 years. And so every year I will pick up what was the best jazz live album. I'll Google that phrase and I'll just listen to them all. Like anything that got nominated, whatever jazz people think is good jazz, that's where I want to start to cultivate a taste. And that's what I do with comics.
Yeah.
Like I'll look at the Eisners. I'll look at Mark Russell's recently won some other awards. Well,
there's the Harveys, the Ringos. There are a lot there, but the Eisners are kind of the biggest and most well known. But yeah, it just having that stamp of approval, as arbitrary as all awards are, whether they're given by kind of regardless of who the governing body is, the fact that you could put an embossed stamp on the cover of a collection, be like Eisner Award winner, so that's enough for some people to just pick it up just to see that, knowing nothing else about it. And so I had hoped that it would win something solely so because I know that would have increased readership immediately after. When that first trade comes out, when the Lux collection comes out, having that bit of recognition would have gone a long way to help increase visibility. But alas, it lost the. Let's see what I have in my notes here. It lost the best limited series to Black Panther: World of Wakanda, which is a very cool series. So that's a tough one to lose. But
no shade there.
Best humor publication is one I thought I had a chance to, and that lost to a book called Baking with Kafka, which I gotta admit didn't read. Although, based on that title, probably pretty funny. But yeah, it lost to that, and that's how it goes. So. Instead of having that kind of a visual signifier to get people in, it continues to rely on word of mouth, people to come in and find this book one way or the other, kind of by hook or by crook, will get people to read this book who would have never considered picking up a Flintstones comic.
Yeah. I mean, and you and I obviously are both guilty of that. And, I know that you will more than likely disagree with this. I would love a Rotten Tomato type thing for comics because I would love an aggregator to say, here's what critics think, here's what fans think. Because I'm thinking of something like Tom King's Batman. Like that would have been one of those chasms where the critics love it and the fan score, there would have been a lot of people trolling that. And you would say, well, what is it that other comic industry and creators and creatives love about this, and why is it that fans hate it? Is this more of a criticism of the fans that we should be looking at? That being said, aggregators should always be, in all reviews and even stamps like an Eisner Award should be an excuse to get into something, not an excuse to dismiss something.
I agree with that, and in a perfect world, that'd be great if it were used that way. I just know
that's how I use it. That's how I commend it to people.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't have any control over what people do or don't do with it.
That if there were something like that, if there were one centralized source of that for comics, I wouldn't need to see the reviews to tell you which books would be praised and lauded and which books would be review bombed by users. It's pretty simple. Is it written by a woman? Yeah, it's gonna get downvoted. Is it a female main character? It's going to get downvoted by.
Does it cover LGBTQ?
Yeah. Does it spotlight? Does it spotlight people that aren't cis white hetero males? Yeah, it's going to get downvoted. So the Flintstones would be a book that I can guarantee critics would almost universally love. It'd have a very high score, and I think your user scores would be a complete binary. You would go through those scores and they'd be, this is the greatest thing ever, this is the stupidest thing ever. Like there would not be, you're not going to get like a 3-star score out of 5. Like 2.5.
Well, I mean, and I think you're right. And I think the binary would actually be here's the people who actually read it, and here's the people who heard about it and what it's doing, and didn't read it and decided they don't want. They're like, how dare you politicize the Flintstones? And it's like, I'm sorry, this book, while it speaks to political science, does not advocate narrowly for one party or for another. And if it's being politicized, that's you projecting your politics onto it.
And I think that there's part of the question of what does the word politicized mean? This book, I would argue this book is political in that it's raising these issues, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Mark Russell is inherently political, but he's not a pundit.
Yeah. And I think what you said was great. Is
political hack.
It's not advocating for anything.
Right.
It's simply advocating for here's the ideas. And you know what you said about the chasm between those have read it and those that haven't. I mean, that's
Mark Russell's career, right?
That is absolutely his career from the very beginning. The first thing he was known for, which I think is what got him his comic work, was this book called God Is Disappointed in You, which is a rewrite on the Bible, I guess. Not really a rewrite. It's a satirical take on the Bible.
It's commentary, yeah.
It has illustrations. It's not a graphic novel work, like a sequential artwork, but it has illustrations by an artist named Shannon Wheeler. But yet what he does in this book is he basically paraphrases and distills every book of the Bible into like a 3 or 4 sentence thesis. Like, here's what this is actually about. Like kind of the no BS, no filler, real true message, kind of blunt message. And shockingly, there are people that didn't like that. He got pushback from that.
Since you've told me about it, it went to my wish list. I have it on my Christmas list for a Secret Santa. So one of my in-laws may end up buying a book for me, and they know that I'm a religious person.
Yeah.
But they may be buying a book for me called God Is Disappointed in You. And they might be like, what is wrong with this guy?
That would be fantastic.
Either they don't know what it is, or they think I've got some great cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
He's I mean, I've found everything he's said to be both funny and so it's like, that to me is like mission accomplished. He's, I would say, primarily a humorist.
Yes.
And
a humorist and a satirist, I think, is what it's
sure. Right. And so it's like, if you watch, Curb Your Enthusiasm, like, it's a weird thing for if someone were to say like, oh, I don't watch that because I don't agree with Larry David's message. It's like, message. Yeah. It's like, like, he's ripping everything to shreds. He's a grumpy old man. That's the message.
Yeah. The message, and the message isn't that he's right about everything. The message is simply, this dude just hates everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's,
I wouldn't say Mark Russell hates everything, but yeah, he is critical of everything. Yeah.
Right. And what he is communicating through his books is satire, which is not to say, like, no one would read this and be like, well, obviously he wants me to go vote Democrat or Libertarian or what. Yeah. It's like, that's an insane conclusion. Sadly, that is the world we live in.
But his work exists in a way where you can spin it. People who can spin can spin anything. That is true.
So let's not sell them short.
That is true. That is true.
These people have twisted minds, and that's what he satirizes.
Yeah, exactly. The people. These are the people he is poking fun at. People he's trying to call out. And oftentimes those people are the ones who are the most oblivious to any commentary on them. They're. It's not that they're above it. It's they don't have the self-awareness. And
right. To me, it reminds me of like,
we see him in both the books we're going to cover, definitely in the Flintstones, and also in Not All Robots, which we'll get to. But the people who are most offended by, or would assume be most offended by the things brought up, the characters brought up and presented in the book, are the ones that have no self-awareness as to why they're offended by it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think. To me, it's people who are, politicizing this book or Mark Russell. it reminds me of like when CNN or Fox News would bring Jon Stewart on and accuse him of like being a political advocate or pundit. And it's like, he's like, I'm on a network where the show leading into me is puppets making crank calls.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
the only legitimate voice I've been given is right here when you brought me onto an extensive news network.
Yeah.
I'm doing comedy. I'm doing satire. I'm Mark Twain. You're trying to treat me like I'm some major political player.
Yeah.
It just shows the absurdity of the system.
Mhm.
And and I think all of these are great analogies, and I think Mark Twain is actually a really good analogy for Mark Russell.
I think so. There aren't. He is. I think Russell is unique in his comic writing in that there's really no one in who is really attempting what he's doing with a lot of his books. Now, not all of his books. I mean, said he has written stuff for the big two, for DC and Marvel, and some of it's silly. And again, and I'm not saying obviously Flintstones is for DC, but he's written superhero stuff. Like he wrote this book called One Star Squadron, which is like, it's a very funny book with artist Steve Lieber. It's like a bunch of like, not even like D-list superheroes. It's called One Star Squadron. So it's a very funny book. It's a very humorous book. Still has some of the, satirizing the idea of, these big superheroes, but it's not as pointed as not as sharp as some of the commentary in his other books. But he also has a book out called Superman Space Age with Mike Allred. That's like a 60s Superman story. It's a lot of fun for storytelling of that era. You and I were talking before we started recording this Marvel book he had, this miniseries called Fantastic Four Life Story, which is a really neat idea that Marvel was doing, which was telling the story of some of their original characters in real time. It started with Spider-Man. They did Spider-Man Life Story where he gets bitten as a teenager in the 60s, and it's kind of reframing all of his classic stories as if he aged in real time, the 70s, 80s, 90s, the early aughts, and the 2010s. They did the same thing with the Fantastic Four, and this is what Mark Russell did. The Fantastic Four go off into space and get these powers in the 60s, and then how would their stories work if they aged in real time for the next 60 years? So, he does have some straightforward, I say straightforward, kind of in scare quotes, but, straightforward superhero for hire stuff. But the thing I think because of Flintstones he is most known for are these little outside the box stories. He worked again, before we leave Hanna-Barbera entirely, he did another book in this Hanna-Barbera sphere with artist Mike Freehand called Exit Stage Left, the Snagglepuss Chronicles, which was just a little 6-issue mini where Snagglepuss is reimagined as a gay Southern Gothic playwright in the 50s. And it's if you read Flintstones and you like this book and you're looking for more from specifically Mark Russell, I think I'd first direct you towards Snagglepuss. It's a really fun, really pointed, really kind of introspective look, kind of in that universe. He basically makes Snagglepuss Tennessee Williams. So if you can put those things in your mind together, why
not?
And then if you're familiar with the cartoon of Snagglepuss and how he talks and the voice in his head, you will read the entire book in that. You hear his voice as you read the book. So that's another kind of avenue where he could use these avatars of these cartoon characters to deliver commentary on the world at large. Going through here, let me see here. I guess what the two things we should really mention before we get off of Flintstones are another collaboration, his follow-up collaboration with Steve Pugh is a book called Billionaire Island, which is another very sharp and obvious commentary on the uber rich, the uber elite.
Which is on my to read list. I have not read it. I'm assuming you give me the name Billionaire Island by a guy named Mark Russell.
Yeah.
I'm considering it a spoof of like Atlas Shrugged. In the same way that like BioShock is. It's like, here's what it is. If this Ayn Randian vision of all of these, super wealthy, ostensibly successful, hardworking, whatever people got their dream state. But this is Mark showing it for its absurdity.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. Yeah, absurdity. I mean, this is Billionaire Island is much further down the absurdist line than the Flintstones is. The Flintstones is still effectively grounded in the idea of the Flintstones, as absurd as some of the things we will talk about in that book are. Billionaire Island is like way off the deep end of absurd, which is part of what makes it really funny. There is currently a sequel to it called Billionaire Island, Isle of Dogs. That's ongoing right now. With
November 2022 just started, right?
Yeah. It just started as we're recording. So that is ongoing. And that's at a publisher called Ahoy Comics. And the important thing about Ahoy is that is where the book Second Coming landed. Second Coming was a book that was supposed to be on, I guess it's supposed to be on Vertigo, DC Vertigo, before Vertigo got shuttered. That Mark Russell wrote, and the art was done by Richard Pace. It was this is probably the most controversy he's had surrounding any of his books. And I guess when I describe you the premise, you'll understand why. Jesus Christ returns to Earth, and he is directed by God, his father, to room with Sunstar, who is the superhero of the world. He is basically a Superman analog. He is to room with him so that he can try and teach Sunstar to better use his abilities to help the world. And at the same time, Jesus looks around at the world and is horrified to see how his message has been corrupted over the past 2,000 years. So it is basically Jesus and what if Jesus and Superman were the odd couple? That is basically what the book is.
I mean, and I like that. And frankly, here's the thing to me. If there was a Christian author who wrote a book about how Jesus' message has been corrupted by the 21st century and over the course of 2,000 years, like bestseller, heralded, big deal. When someone outside of the faith writes the same criticism, it gets boycotted. Right. They're a pariah. And it's I just don't understand. It's like, can we look at the criticism, the merit of the criticism, rather than basing all of our reaction on the source of it?
It's message versus messenger, right? It's like, if it's one of us saying this, it's fine because it's safe,
right.
Well,
but
if it's someone on the outside saying it, that person's a heretic,
Right. And it's clearly like by design an absurd premise.
Yes.
Right. And it's like, I'm sorry, if you think if you relate that deeply to this absurd premise that is clearly not reality, perhaps the problem here is that you are not living in reality. Yeah. Which is why this non-real criticism really affects you.
Yeah. But, the criticism was enough to have the book get pulled. I think it sat on the shelf for about a year. Thankfully, Mark Russell and Richard Pace were able to take the idea somewhere else. DC let them go and shop it around. And like I said, it ended up on Ahoy Comics. Ahoy is a very small publisher, but it here's the thing. When it was solicited and then came out on Ahoy, wasn't a whole lot of protest, wasn't a whole lot of pushback. It was just because I guess it was coming out on DC Vertigo. It was coming out on something big, and it had that grabbed the news headlines. And then a year later, when it finally did come out, it came out, and the book's really funny. The book is really good. And again, if you like the things you see in Flintstones, you'll like Second Coming, I think.
Yeah, and if I were to make an educated guess, I would guess the difference is if your comic shop stocks Ahoy without a specific solicit from you, it's not on the main rack when you walk in. Whereas, Marvel, DC, and probably even Image are going to be on the Fresh Wednesday wall, whereas the Ahoy thing is going to be immediately buried. So I think you had to go out of your way to be offended when it's on Ahoy. Whereas it's a lot more convenient to be offended on the big two.
That is true. But again, we're not talking about what's actually in the book, because the material stayed the same. It's being published. It's out there. You can get it. You can get it in a comic shop. You can get it digitally. The book's available. The message is still there. It's just the means at which it's being delivered is different. And so the fervor dies down. So that's kind of and Second Coming came on the heels of the Flintstones. The Flintstones gave him that critical adoration. People writing about comics were like, "Ooh, what's the next Mark Russell book going to be?" And that helped books like Snagglepuss. That helped some of his, when he did some of his other DC work, like he wrote a Wonder Twins book for the Wonder Comics line that Brian Michael Bendis started when he moved over to DC. So he became a name that some people began to recognize, and definitely that I began to recognize, after the Flintstones, when I saw him on that Snagglepuss book, when I saw him on Second Coming, when him and Steve Pugh came back together and did Billionaire Island. He became one of those guys that if I see his name, I may not read everything. It may not be like I see some past situation just quite yet, but I'm interested in seeing,
what's his take?
What's the next thing he's gonna shoot at that he's gonna try and take down. And especially if it's going to be with Steve Pugh, which is why I when Billionaire Island came out, I was all in on that, because I think for kind of as lengthy as a guy like Steve Pugh has had in his career, he did a lot of work kind of early in the 90s, early aughts, kind of on some like second wave Vertigo titles, did a lot of Hellblazer, a lot of Animal Man, and really made a name for himself. But I didn't know anything about him until he got hooked up with Mark Russell and started doing these funny satires, these very kind of cartoonish satires. And now I think he's more known for that.
There's an underlying key point here that I think is what these Zero episodes are about. Sometimes, there's an artist like that where Steve Pugh, I've Googled him, you look at his stuff, it's like, I like everything he draws. I don't have the season pass per se with him.
Yeah.
But the secret sauce of Steve Pugh with Mark Russell is one of those things where it's like, I'm going to go ahead and grab the first issue with like whatever they're doing.
Yeah.
I believe in this partnership, is greater than the sum of all the parts.
Yeah. And that's one of those cliche. That's one of those things you can't predict, that kind of alchemy, because I believe, especially a lot of times
at these kind of books, it's a random pairing.
Exactly. It's not his choice, and I think his being Mark Russell's choice. I think he was paired with them, and I think Mark Russell's talked about this. It was like he knew who Steve Pugh was, he knew the name, but it was like, is this going to work? And all of a sudden, it works perfectly. One of the things I think about, two of our favorite creators, Mike, are Tom King and and Mitch Gerrits.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
They came together because Tom King had this book at Vertigo called Sheriff of Babylon about, kind of about his time over in Iraq and Afghanistan. And at the time, Mitch Gerrits was the guy who drew military stuff. He had drawn like the Punisher. He drew guns and stuff like that, modern day military stuff. And so they threw them together and they worked together, and something clicked. And those guys realized, hey, we should be best friends. Like, this is someone, not just someone who is capable of drawing the story that I've written, but like, this is a guy that I'm going to be friends with the rest of and I'm going to be partners with this guy, and we're going to work together on all sorts of things. And that only happened because we had a book that was set in like a modern day war zone. And so we're going to get a guy who at the time was just known for drawing modern day war zone stuff, Yeah,
I mean, and I think
that's what works.
That's the guy they had on similar. We're going to see the same dynamic when we inevitably cover something by Jeff Lemire, Andrea Sorrentino.
Yeah,
because they got paired up on Green Arrow,
or maybe
in the middle of a run.
Yeah, or maybe Jeff Lemire and Dustin Wynn, something like that. Anytime you get these pairings where, and I think for me, one of the big things is, and I think Lemire and Sorrentino are really good. Good example. When a writer and artist get paired together on a on a for-hire basis, that's something at the big two, something at DC and Marvel, and they do work together, whether it's a long run or a short run. If that team then a couple years later, all of a sudden have a creator-owned book at Image or Boom or something like that, I'm going to read that book because that tells me they liked working together. And whether or not their superhero run was successful or not, whether or not I liked it or not, they got paired together and worked on a property that wasn't theirs. And they enjoyed that so much, they were talking offline and said, you know what, we have an idea, we're going to work together now. You know, we're going to do something together now. And I think that is something we see here with Mark Russell and Steve Pugh. They get put together on this Flintstones book, and maybe they're starting to connect on some of the satire and the social commentary, and maybe they're clicking on a shared view of the world. And so they take that and they take that kind of energy, that bonding, and they throw that into Billionaire Island, which is a very similar sort of satire. When you look at that book, in terms of the kind of cartoonish nature, it's very colorful, it's very bright, much like the Flintstones. There's a lot of similar elements there. But the idea that they would be thrown together, kind of have a meeting of the minds, you know, and then go into their own story, their own book. That to me as a reader is something I look for as a signal of, if this team liked working together so much that they're willing to go in together on a book, you know, then maybe that's something I should think about investing in my own time and money in. You know?
Yeah, and I really doubt they mean it. And by they, I mean the creators. I doubt they mean it as the flare gun that I interpret it as. But to me, that's the signal of like,
oh yeah, no.
We know we've got the chemistry
exactly
to do this anywhere.
Exactly, especially if you, especially when I read that, hey, it's just a writer or a couple writers, and they're thrown in with an artist who maybe it's a new artist, maybe it's an old artist, they have no connection with them. If that group then goes on and do their own thing, that tells me they're talking about stuff outside of just the scripts and the pages getting sent back. You know, they're talking about, hey, what other stories do you kind of like? You know, what other storytelling do you like? What kind of genres do you like? Forget about what we're working on. Yeah, we're doing this run on Green Arrow, or we're doing this run on the Titans or whatever. We're doing a run on some B-level Marvel book, whatever that is. They're talking about something else. They're talking about other shared ideas, other things they like, and then they channel that a couple years later into their own book where they're still working together. And I'm with you there. I don't know if it's meant to be a signal flare, but for me, it is. Whenever I see that partnership bleed out of for-hire work and into creator-owned stuff, you know, and it tells me that this team wants to be a team, you know?
Yeah, I mean,
wants to keep working together.
Like, I guess I don't follow this stuff as closely, but it would be like if a director who you like, you know, gets five episodes in a season of a show that you watch, and then you hear 18 months later the star of that show is starring in a movie directed by that guy, because 100%. That guy was like, oh, this guy gets everything I'm telling him. Yeah, we're definitely just constrained by this show, so let's go make our own thing together, and it's going to be fire.
I agree entirely. Yeah. When
that being said, I don't follow directors and actors that closely.
But I think
the analogy,
it's the same kind of partnership. Yeah, that when you're the idea that when you're, because of your circumstance, because of your job, when you're forced to work with someone not of your choosing on something creative you're interested in, and that creative partnership works in that constraint, when that pairing or that group then wants to go and make their own thing together, you know, you come together by happenstance or circumstance, and then you decide to stay together and keep working on something else, that I think is exciting. And so now
you and I have spoken, like, you know, we go to conventions and stuff. I've spoken to enough writers and artists to know how real these random pairings are. I mean, even if you don't go to those things and you just read the letters in the back of issues.
Yeah.
You know, the first issue, I think, of Gideon Falls talks about how Sorrentino and Lemire got together on Green Arrow, and then were paired again at Marvel for Old Man
Logan.
Man Logan, and then they were like, Jeff was like, when I think something, he makes it appear.
Yeah.
And like when you have a guy like that, you just got to keep feeding him. And you got to see where this thing will go. And so I know it's a real sensation, and I just love finding it when it happens. And we shouldn't really overlook Chris Chuckery as the colorist here, because he also followed them to Billionaire Island.
Yes.
And I think we will discuss, you notice when the colors change, I think in issue 7, not in a bad way, but you just notice like, oh, this is a slightly different vibe.
But Chris Chuckery still colors that, but because
Pugh didn't pencil it.
Yeah, because it's a different artist, and because, as we talk about, a little different framing device. It's a little more muted, but it's all intentional. And I think, again, Billionaire Island, in a similar sense to what the Flintstones is that it's very cartoony. It's meant to be very bright, very loud. It's meant to be very, it's meant to pop off the page, which I think is very interesting when we, if we can kind of transition out of the Flintstones here and into our next book, kind of our tag along book in Not All Robots, and that it's a totally different vibe, totally different artistic style and sense.
Right.
Everything about it in terms of presentation is completely different, but the message is still there. The commentary is still there. It's just, on the surface, you wouldn't see anything. You wouldn't see any sort of correlation. They wouldn't look the same. They wouldn't feel the same, unless you kind of looked beyond and got into the nitty gritty of the message.
Yeah, I mean, in the same way that I hate to keep using film analogies here, but someone I was talking to, I was shocked because I said that like Thor Ragnarok and Jojo Rabbit follow the exact same beats. It's the exact same storytelling. And the same goes for Hunt for the Wilder People. It's Taika Waititi.
Yeah.
He's the common thread. He will tell a story in a certain way. There's always going to be some absurdist comedy. There's always going to be the great loss, death of something that you love at the end of the first act. And then, someone forging a new sense of family, as the story progresses. That's the Taika formula. And for those who are like Taika people, that it works every time he pulls it off. Mileage may vary for people that you don't like his comedy or don't like his storytelling, but you know what you're getting with Taika Waititi in the same way you know what you're getting with Mark Russell.
Yeah, it's just
there's no way he's not going to say something about society.
Yes,
right?
yes. And there's a good chance because he has this like Contra spray gun of like nothing is sacred. There's a very good chance that you will find yourself in what you believe in at least one of the crosshairs. So it's not just that it's not just that he's going against social. He's just going against pointing out flaws and things in society. You yourself, the reader, at some point will feel I don't want to say victimized, but you will feel like you will be in this picture and you won't like it. You will be tagged in this photo and you're not going to like it because it's going to show that mirror. That mirror is going to be reflected on all society, and at least once at some point it's going to be right back on you, and you're going to feel a little icky because you've been laughing at everything else he's been doing the whole time and how spot on he is when he talks about this, that, and the other, and then all of a sudden he's talking about you and the things that you believe or things you might believe and your viewpoint, and you're going to be like, oh wait, am I the bad guy here all of a sudden? So he's not afraid to take on anything and any topic. Whether it's bright and cartoony, literally cartoony like the Flintstones, or a little more muted, a little more almost photorealistic that we see in Not All Robots.
Yeah. And there's so much I want to say about these books. We are non-spoiler. This is our pitch. Yeah, this is our pitch for these books and these artists. So do you want to dive into Not All Robots, or you want to
Yeah, sure.
wrap on these creators?
I think we'll jump into Not on Robots and touch on where this book come from and a little bit I think on why we think it's a good pairing for Flintstones. When again, I think something like Billionaire Island may have been a little more obvious pairing because again, same creative team, similar kind of sentiment. But I think Not All Robots actually works really well and as kind of a companion book to the Flintstones. Maybe a little more so than the Billionaire Island. But anyway, Not All Robots, a book that was Mike Russell wrote with artist. So what did we decide on? Deodato, Mike Deodato Jr.
Mike Deodato, yeah.
Yeah, Mike Deodato, who is a Brazilian artist who is most known for extensive work at Marvel. We'll cover that in a second here. Well, actually, we'll cover that now.
I mean, it's safe to say you've seen his stuff before.
Yeah.
If you've been reading comics, but you may not know you've seen it.
But he's someone that if you know his style and you like his style, you'll recognize it because it does stand out. There's an element of photorealism to the way he draws, which obviously doesn't exist for what Steve Pugh is doing now, which is very cartoony, very kind of over the top. Deodato doesn't have that in his art. But at Marvel, I mean, for the past 20-ish years, up until about 2017, 2018, I mean, these are just some of the characters he worked on, like the Avengers, Iron Man, the X-Men, Amazing Spider-Man, kind of no-name characters, right? And here are some of the writers he worked with: J. Michael Straczynski, Brian Michael Bendis, Jonathan Hickman, Warren Ellis, Ed Brubaker, Jason Aaron, Charles Soule. So again, that's like the real C-list level writers at Marvel.
I forgot while you were reading that if we were reading like the Hall of Fame of modern comics or if it was the partnerships. Those
are
Deodato. Literally
the biggest writers. Those are the people that have shaped Marvel Comics in the past 20 some odd years, which makes sense now as to why he would be working at this studio called AWA, which stands for Writers, Artists, and Artisans. It was established in 2018 under three founders. Kind of the main one, though, was Axel Alonso, who was a former executive and editor-in-chief at Marvel, up until, I think, 2018, 2019, when he was replaced as editor-in-chief by the current editor-in-chief of Marvel, C.B. Cebulski. So Axel Alonso, along with Bill Jemas and another guy, Jonathan Perkins. Bill Jemas was another former exec at Marvel. So these are guys who have worked in comics, specifically at Marvel, going over to found their own studio. And so some of the talent they initially brought over were guys that had worked at Marvel. Their first major book was a book called The Resistance, which was J. Michael Straczynski, who comic legend, sci-fi legend. He created Babylon 5, the TV show. That was Straczynski with Deodato on art. So these guys had worked together during Axel Alonso's time at Marvel. They worked on Amazing Spider-Man together, and they were brought on, and that was the main launch title, the first main launch title for AWA. And you may not have heard of AWA if you're a comic person. It's probably not one you're super aware of, and it probably has to do with some unfortunate timing. They launched in early 2020. The first book, The Resistance, again, this main flag title, this flagship book on what's called the Upshot imprint. And The Resistance is like a whole umbrella, the whole universe of books set in this same setting.
That being said, let me say, I think it actually benefited them to come around about when they did, because I think the only way I actually discovered Not All Robots before I discovered the Flintstones. That's how backwards my chronology is here. And I found it because when the pandemic hit and, comic shops were shut down, comic printing was shut down, I wanted to support my local comic shop. So I started just browsing the internet for like all solicits and pools, of anything in the last year, and found and I was like, not all robots, but I found something from AWA, and I was like, oh, I've never even heard of this. I wonder if my comic shop has it. And I went on their website and looked, and I was like, oh yeah, it's there. I just you just can't see what you're not looking for sometimes on a Wednesday.
Yeah.
And you and I both go like on our lunch break, which is not a great time to like, let's go look at every obscure publisher they've got on the wall here. It's like
sometimes I do.
You've got a pull list,
makes for a long lunch. But yeah, I know what you're saying. The time is limited out most times. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I think, and a lot of people started discovering, digital reading in that time too.
Oh, definitely.
And there's, it's just a lot easier to stumble across stuff digitally than sometimes in a shop, where shops are designed to sell perhaps the big two at times. And online retailers.
Yeah, I mean the vast majority of them, well, because part of it also is, if you're buying a whole bunch of copies of Batman and Spider-Man, you're probably going to sell those. You're going to make money on those. If you're asking a shop to invest in a new comic from a new publisher, because the thing to remember is, comic publishers, their customers are not readers. Their customers are shops,
right?
So they have to sell to them, and then the shop sells to us. So if the shop doesn't think they can sell to the reader, they're not going to be investing in a book that they think they can make a profit on. So again, a new book coming out, but again, part of the issue was this first book from AWA. It was released March 18th, 2020. If we go back, and that book, by the way, The Resistance, let's read the synopsis here. Let's see. Humanity faced with a deadly pandemic that, that's bad.
That's tough. Yeah.
That's a tough beat to be released the first half of March 2020. But, it did come out, and there are a number of books that are in the, in the Resistance umbrella. It's an interesting idea. It's pretty neat if you can get past the idea that, again, a pandemic has ravaged society and humanity. But I don't know if it's thriving. I have no idea if it's thriving or not, but it does exist and it's out there, and they're publishing books. And, I would not have known of Not All Robots if you hadn't suggested it. Obviously I know Mark Russell, and I think I had heard of it because, we talked about how they lost the Mark Russell had been nominated for some Eisners, specifically for the Flintstones, and had lost. But, Not All Robots was nominated for Eisners earlier this year, right? The book came out in 2021 to 2022, and in the early 2022 Eisners, it won for the best humor publication. The one I thought it could win. Flintstones could have won back in the day,
Yeah, I mean, and deservingly so. I think sometimes
definitely. It also did lose. It did lose, however. It was also nominated for Best New Series, which lost to Nice House on the Lake, which isn't a bad thing because the 2022 Eisners, James Tynion IV won quite literally everything for everything he put out, which is also well deserved. But it did win the best humor. So I was aware of the book. But again, I wasn't aware of. I knew AWA, but I wasn't aware of Mike Deodato. Because again, he was still in that category, like you mentioned, of, I've seen his work before. And when I started going through some of the titles, specifically some of the titles like Original Sin, Secret Avengers, Dark Avengers, Hickman's Event, I was like, okay, I know this guy from Marvel. But then it also hit me that another place that I had read his stuff, and it didn't stick in my brain. It didn't stick in my brain until I read Not All Robots and went back through his kind of CV, his bibliography.
Well, where I would know him from, right? Like, no, it's from Dark Horse with Jeff Lemire, Berserker Unbound.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Bizarre 4-issue thing. And I remember the book just didn't grab me. But I got all the issues because it was an automatic pull because it was Jeff Lemire.
Sure.
And I did really love the art in there. And I knew, the names Lemire and Deodato are very prominent on the front cover. So I knew it was burned into my brain from somewhere, but I had to like open my CLZ app and type in, DEODAT, and it's like, Berserker Unbound. That's where I know it.
You go back and see what you own from him. Yeah. And for me, it was, when I went back and really thought about it, Deodato is a name that I think people, as we're recording right now, people may be a little more familiar with, or his name's coming up because Marvel Studios just released Black Panther Wakanda Forever. And if you stay to the end like you should, and you watch all the credits like you should, in these special thanks, you will see Mike Deodato's name in the credits, because during the run of Invincible Iron Man, he and Brian Michael Bendis are the credited co-creators for Riri Williams, who is aka Ironheart, who makes her debut in Wakanda Forever and will have her own show on Disney Plus. And that was where I remembered the name from, of something that I had read relatively recently, because I don't think I read Invincible Iron Man when it first came out, which was 2016, I think, was when Riri was created. I think I had read Riri in some other books, like in Champions and her own solo series that like Eve Ewing wrote. So I went back and read a couple years later the introduction and all that. So I knew Deodato's name from that. So when I saw it on this book, again, that was staying in the back of my mind, like, this name, but I couldn't pick out any of the titles until I saw them. And then once I remembered the titles, once I saw what they were and could picture the art, and then I could see, oh yeah, right, I see the same visual style. Now I know what Deodato's style is. I can probably recognize it a little more on cue. But yeah, he was someone that I just didn't have at top of mind, but realized that I've read a lot of his books.
Sure,
he's someone I've read a lot of.
I think the other implicit thing here is that he must not do much of the Comic-Con circuits, because you go to a fair amount of them, and if you saw, Mike Deodato was going to be at this one, you would have already gone through your collection, and identified all the Mike Deodato. So,
and that's part of
he works out of Brazil, and I don't think he really comes to the States for stuff.
And that's a lot of thing. There are plenty of artists, plenty of great artists who have great partnerships with a lot of writers here in the States, whom have never met because they live in Brazil or Argentina or Spain or Portugal, whatever. These people who have never met, but they have great partnerships and great connections with. And yeah, Deodato is one of those guys that if he ever did a con kind of near me on the eastern part of the country, he was someone I would have issues for and be totally stoked to go see. But yeah, because he hasn't, there is a little bit of a disconnect, knowing that, he's just kind of plugging away in Brazil, just killing it whenever he gets a chance, but is not a name whose style is top of mind, or it wasn't top of mind at the time. But now that I've seen more of his stuff and seen what he can do kind of in a non-superhero setting, because again, everything I read of him, everything I had read by him was all superhero stuff and all Marvel stuff. And he's done a little bit of, I think, a lot of bit of DC stuff. I think mainly some Wonder Woman stuff that I don't know if I've read here or there. So it's mainly all Marvel stuff. So that's what I associate with it. But to see him do non-superhero work on Not All Robots, I think has opened me up to his art in a different way, which I think is really, really cool. Is that you have a guy who's not just pegged as a superhero guy, not just drawing people in capes and cowls, but drawing, I'm going to say, real people in a kind of hyper real setting that Not All Robots is.
Well,
but, they're not heroes.
But I think that stuff all served him for the texture of this. He has a letter in the back of the trade for Not All Robots where he says, all of that experience served him well because, in classic superhero storytelling, people's body language tells a lot of the story, not just facial expressions. And you're trying to tell the story before the words even appear on the page. And he said, this was an insanely difficult book because you don't have facial expressions. There's so many robots.
Yeah.
So you have to try to do body language with robots, realizing there are constraints with the way robots move. And there are a lot of robots to distinguish from one another. And as I read his letter, and it's a short letter, I mean, it's less than a page, I was like, oh, this is actually like a masterclass in comic art that wasn't in my mind when I picked the book. I suggested that we cover this book because of Mark Russell. And as I'm reading it, I read that letter and then I reread the series, and I was like, oh yeah, Mike Deodato did some heavy lifting on this book.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, because I think one thing that you'll hear us talk about in terms of the art is that kind of in terms of what may have been a little extra in terms of storytelling. And I think what Steve Pugh does in Flintstones is a little different than what Deodato does in Not All Robots, but they're both essential to the story. I think as you read Flintstones, you will see additional commentary, additional humor, additional kind of satire in what Pugh is doing in the background in his art and things of that nature. What I think Deodato does is he adds storytelling and character depth, because there's obviously a more serialized narrative in through the 5 issues of Not All Robots than the 12 issues of Flintstones. But the connecting tissue between the two is the directed social commentary. But I do think, I think what Deodato does is he adds much greater story, much greater depth, specifically with character. That is, I think, less necessary. It's less important in Flintstones because of what that book's trying to accomplish. So I think in both cases, you see the additive nature, or the essential additive nature of the artwork to the storytelling in terms of what you're trying to get across, what the point of your book is. What, is it selling a theme? Is it telling a story? Whatever it is, the artist is adding so much. And if you lose that, if you take that away and it's just the words, you don't get nearly the same effect.
Yeah. And I think I don't like, this isn't to put anyone else down, but this is not a book that anyone could have done the art for.
Probably not. You get radically different books with different artists. You can't get the same tone or same message with a different artist. A different artist would have done, like, let's say he had done this book with Steve Pugh. You could still have the same kind of satire, the same kind of commentary that Not All Robots is trying to bring, but it would have been way funny, intentionally way funnier. It'd been way more absurd. It would have been way more out there. The tone would not have been the same. And if that's the tone they're trying to go for, it would have been great. If that's the tone you're trying to go for, but you have Mike Deodato do the art, I don't think it would have worked. So I think It was intentional. They're going for a different way, a different entry point into the kind of commentary they're trying to make. That Deodato's art really, really works for, because your colors are pretty muted. There is this kind of, I hate using the word gritty and grounded when we talk about muted color, but that's what it is, right? I mean, when it's desaturated like that, it's because, again, Flintstones is super bright, jumps off the page. You don't have that with Not All Robots, and that's intentional. It's meant to be, it's meant to reflect, I think, where society is, that their society is, that we'll talk about in Not All Robots, where humanity is in the pecking order of things. That's the world, that's society. It's not all bright and shiny and optimistic, as it were, as Flintstones ultimately is. It's a little more of a downer. And I think the art shows that, and the kind of photorealism that Deodato goes for, that Deodato uses, really conveys that strongly and effectively.
Yeah. So just, I can't think of a stronger plug for Deodato and / Not All Robots. And I think we kind of covered Deodato's background.
Yeah.
There, major hits. Was there anything else we need to say about Steve Pugh?
I don't think so. I think we covered that, kind of well enough. We covered both, it is interesting, though. You think about how, Russell can work with both these artists here and get a similar intended result, but it's all about different approach. Steve Pugh is a British-based artist who has, worked in again, also superhero background as well. Deodato is a Brazilian artist with a superhero background, and yet we both get these commentaries that are just they're toned differently. The vibes are different, but you're still getting the same sort of message, the same sort of commentary, the same sort of satire. It's just it's a different package, but when you read them back to back, you can see the through line that Russell that Mark Russell weaves through so many of his stories in terms of how he views the world, what he sees as some of the problems with it, some of the issues with it. And, those problems evolve. And I think one thing I think we'll talk about in the Not All Robots episode is the specific issues that were the impetus behind creating Not All Robots. What the Flintstones issue version of that would have been like. Because obviously Flintstones, the issues that were discussed it's
actually
really
a beat that we discuss. It was a throwaway line in Flintstones.
Yeah, it is, but it's not.
I was clamoring for, like, I wish he would have done something more with this, and bam, he does it just in a totally different setting, in another book, another artist.
Because
totally different flavor.
Because it wasn't a major issue in society when Flintstones was being written. This is, what Not All Robots covers is something that came far more in the forefront in the years after Flintstones. So I think it'd be really interesting to see what the Flintstoneized version of this topic would have been. Obviously he didn't get a chance to do that, but he gets to do it in Not All Robots. And so I think, it's why I think some of these books, why his books work well together as kind of you could almost group all of his books, all of his kind of satire humor books into one Mark Russell umbrella and read them all of a piece together. You could really look at them all in totality and get what his worldview is and what his mindset is and what he thinks about society and how he thinks we can change.
Yeah. And I would also say reading them chronologically, with an awareness of here's the month and year this came out.
Yes.
Huge context for Mark Russell. That being said, definitely. I don't think they're dated. They're kind of timeless, but they were certainly of a moment, right?
That's a really, really great point in that, yes, it is informative to know when Flintstones is being written and published to help you. It helps understand what that book's about. It helps to know what was going on in the world when he came up with the idea for Not All Robots. It's informative in that way. And yet you can read Flintstones now for the first time, 6 years after it came out, and you're going to understand it all because a lot of those issues are still there. It's a book that you can come back to, I think, at any time, because maybe some of the specifics aren't there, but the general idea of society, some of those viewpoints, some of those stances are still there. I think Not All Robots will be a similar idea, because those are a lot of the issues he's pointing at are some of the ones that are like most ingrained in society, unfortunately. And it takes massive change to try and alter and get out of. So yeah, they are simultaneously of the time they were written and also timeless in their execution.
Yeah. And by the way, if anyone out there is, I don't know, pursuing a PhD in pop culture criticism, I think there's a lot of ripe material for the 2016 election. It permeated comic books in a way that, I mean, maybe no event since like World War II has in terms of comic books, because like I'm thinking.
I mean, 9/11 would be the other one.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. Yeah. But still, those are enough years apart that's a monumental. We go back to our first series in Paper Girls, and he puts the girls forward in 2016. They see a sign for Hillary for president. Yeah. And this is before he wrote that, before the election. I can't remember if it was released after the election, but the girls said, no way a woman becomes president, because they're teenagers from the 80s, and they don't see that much progress happening in 20 years, which is crazy. Yeah. And then the issue of the Flintstones, where there's an election, was timed to be released during the week of the 2016 election,
meaning it was written months before,
and that wasn't there was no I don't think you could say there's a 1-to-1 Hillary candidate, Trump candidate in that issue of the Flintstones. but just the idea of this is on everyone's mind.
Yeah.
And here are some of the broad stroke problems with the two-choice system.
Yes,
So the context matters. It's deeply impacted by real world events, but it's not so shallow that its relevance as a piece of art is over as soon as that moment has passed. And I think that's the brilliance of Mark Russell. And I think if I have to make a pitch for people at the end of this, zero episode of Creator Spotlight, I identify as I think in like my Instagram bio and Twitter bio as a recovering cynic. I'm someone who through all of my 20s, had a very caustic, cynical, negative outlook of everything. I would rip down, every person, every institution, believed in very little. And I'm now in my, mid to late 30s, and I'm recovering from that. And I think the funny thing is that the world it's more like cynicism is more easily justified in the current world than the world that I was cynical in.
Yeah,
and
it's only gotten worse in the last 20 years.
Well, I mean, you're more aware of how bad things are for many, many people.
That's a good point. Yeah,
and I think
it hasn't gotten worse. Yeah, our awareness of how terrible it is has gotten
right. And I think that right there is the one of the key distinctions for me. But anyway, as I was reading the first 6 issues of the Flintstones, I felt myself starting to relapse. Like it was like an alcoholic getting offered some Johnny Walker Blue. Mm-hmm. Shouts to Leo McGarry.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh boy, this tastes really good. Yeah. But I don't know if this is good for me to be reading this.
It feeds all the bad the things the bad parts of that old you, the parts are there. It's feeding all the things you were trying to correct. Yeah.
But I don't want to be a person who is hopeful by sticking his head in the sand. Mm-hmm. And so it was a really helpful exercise for me to read this. But also, I will tell you that if you're in that boat and you start just saying, oh my gosh, this is so caustic and it's so negative and it's so cynical, keep going. Go to volume
definitely.
2.
Yeah.
Volume 2, you will see there is a bottom to his cynicism, and there is an ends, that the cynicism is a means to an end. It is not the end in and of itself. Yeah. And the same thing is absolutely true for Not All Robots. Mm-hmm. I don't, it's not a feel-good story. Neither of them are. But
Flintstones has some feel-good moments to it, I think. But I think that's also kind of,
but that's
disguised in some of the artwork there.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yes, there are uplifting things. There are reasons for hope, reasons for optimism, but it's not a feel-good piece. You're not going to sell this to some sentimental fool because it's going to leave them in tears before they get to anything that they'll identify with. But if you are like me and you're like, I just can't take any more of this barrage of negativity, keep going. That's my advice for Mark Russell. Like, absolutely read these things. You will benefit immensely from them. And, like, if nothing else, you will laugh your butt off.
Yeah.
I think you and I laughed more during the Flintstones recordings than we have during anything else. Yeah. And I laughed out loud while reading these, probably more so than any other comic. I'm not like a Deadpool reader. I don't read a lot of humor comics. But, this one really had me laughing out loud in a room by myself reading a comic book, which is a rare treat for me.
Again, there aren't a lot of comics that are like expressly humor. Like, this is meant to be funny. It's also meant to be biting social commentary. But they're also just meant to be like just funny moments. There will be absolutely hilarious moments, and there are also a lot of deep and touching introspective moments. But that's the kind of comic Mark Russell's trying to present, whether it's in the Stone Age with the Flintstones or 30 some odd years in the future in Not All Robots. It's going to be funny, but you're right. It's going to seem bleak. It's going to start by showing you, here's the worst things about society and here's why they're terrible. But that's not all he's trying to tell you. It's not just about tearing it down. It's not just about pointing out all the flaws and how bad things are. It's about showing what could be on the other side and what it might take to get there. And that things may be bad now and things are bad now, but there's always the possibility that there could be something better. Not that you're saying, not that it's meant to be super optimistic or meant to be super hopeful or all that, but it's not all dour doom and gloom.
No, and I think it shows you that there's something worth fighting for, and the fight is a worthy one.
Yes.
And I think that's the takeaway for me from Mark Russell. So, you may think, oh my gosh, he's going hard after politics. He's going hard after religion. He's going hard even after science. Everything is in his crosshairs, but it's because he sees the potential in all things.
In all of it, yes.
And I think that's where he always lands. So, and this is, I think, in no way spoiler, but it's just to say, if it doesn't grab you immediately, I really, really urge you to stick with it. And if you can't stomach it for the first 6 issues of Flintstone, like I said earlier, you could probably start in issue 7 and read through to the end. You're just going to be missing, you're going to missing the full reward. It's like when you there's some great hike in South America that you can go on, and there are 2 ways to do it, and one is like a 3-day hike through this mountain or whatever, and the other one is a train that you can take that goes around the mountain and spits you out at the other side. And I was reading an author who did the hiking portion of it, and he said, he arrived at the same time as some of the people who took like a scenic train ride, and he said, we were both looking at the same magnificent vista, but we had totally different views of it. And I think that's the thing about Mark Russell. Like, if you just jump to Flintstones 12 and you say, oh, those are some like optimistic, upbeat, or happy resolutions, or that's a sentimental, touching moment, it's like, yeah, but you didn't earn it. Like, you earn it by going through everything he has to say, really get into the trenches with him, and then say, oh, despite all of this, here's this beautiful message he has for us.
I agree. And I think also it works across, I think it can work across the series as well. Like I think we would recommend reading Flintstones first and then reading Not All Robots. I think it can work that way because you can see you'll be primed for what happens in Not All Robots and his understanding and his viewpoint by going through the whole journey there. I think it works. I think it sets you up to really take in everything he has to say in Not All Robots. Not saying, again, not that they're actually connected, not that you can't read them in any order, but I think it's helpful to understanding kind of the setup and the payoff that he likes to go for with his commentary.
Yeah, and I think we're I flatter myself, but I think we're both intelligent readers, and I think this is a practice of an intelligent reader, is to read more than one thing by an author, read them in chronological order of release, and you can see the evolution in thinking in the author.
Yes.
And not just see it, but appreciate it.
Yes. And appreciating that and being aware of that helps inform not only the thing you're reading, but the thing you just read as well. So tracking his evolution, Mark Russell's evolution as a writer, as a comic writer, specifically in comics, from his earliest days to his current days now, the past 6-7 years, being aware of where he started and seeing where he is now helps us understand the story we're reading, Not All Robots, and also looking backward on the things he started with, like the Flintstones. I think that all that's helpful, all that's informative, and it makes for a richer experience than just picking up a good book and reading it and getting the message of that book. Seeing it in totality with an author's kind of full resume is where some of the real magic and the real cool connections lie, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's all I've got to say. I mean, if after this impassioned plea from your 2 podcasters, if you still aren't tempted to read the Flintstones or Not All Robots, join us for the next one. Go listen to the last one. We have books, I think, for everyone at some point in time. But if you trust us at all, if you've enjoyed anything we've ever covered, check out Flintstones. Check out Not All Robots.
Absolutely, 100%.
And with that, we will see you next Thursday for Flintstones Volume 1, Issues 1 through 6, if you are reading in single issue format. And again, if it's a tad cynical for you, keep going. It's going to be worth the payoff. And if you're getting thin-skinned about it, just remember it's comedy. It's satire. Laugh. Laugh when things make you uncomfortable, and just keep going, because he is absolutely worth the payoff. And with that, we will see you next week. Thanks for listening, and we're looking forward to it for Not All Robots and Flintstones.